Where's the options? Okay. I got it.
Are you folks ready to get started?
Yeah.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first Zoom call of the Place-Based Justice Network for the 2018-2019 academic year. My name is Ross Watts, and I am a part of the subgroup of our network that is responsible for continuous learning. And I sit on the subgroup with Erin Burrows at Seattle U and Karen Cotterman at the University of San Francisco. And so we have been working over the summer to get some Zoom calls together to make sure that we can all continue perfecting our practice and growing in the work that we do over this academic year. The thing that I like about being on the continuous learning subgroup is that it's really a very important part of what the network does. In fact, in the very first sentence defining what the network is, we call ourselves a learning community. So there's a big emphasis put on our continued learning and growth. So I welcome you all to this process, and I hope that you will continue to join us in future Zoom calls, which I'll talk about toward the end of this call today. Today, the subgroup thought it would be a good idea to have everyone get an introduction to the values statement that the network developed this past year. It would be a way to kind of inform our practice. And there are a lot of good reasons for this. First of all, value statements are pretty powerful. If you've been following the news in the European Union, for instance, there's a big debate about values and whether certain member nations of the EU might be representing the values of the entire European Union and whether they should stay members or not in the case of Hungary. So value statements, I think, allow us to find unity in the work that we do, and then I think better to pursue the justice that we're trying to realize in the communities that we're affecting. But these values are really new to our group, and I think that's worth acknowledging. For those of you on the call who, this may be your first Zoom call, this may be your first year being involved with a network, you should know that the value statement is relatively recent. It was developed this last February in 2018 with some of the existing members of the network coming together at a leadership retreat. So given that it's new to all of us, even those of us who've been a part of the network for a few years, I thought it was a good idea to spend certainly this fall semester and into the spring exploring the values and thinking about what they mean for us as a group. So certainly if you're new, this is a great time actually to be joining the network and getting familiar with the work that we do and understanding our values. So to that end, I asked two members of our steering committee, our executive committee, Kent Koth from Seattle U and Jennifer Pigza from St. Mary's University, to talk about the values overall. Later Zoom calls will focus on individual values or individual aspects of a single value that the network shares. But this is kind of the 10,000-foot overview. Kent and Jennifer were involved in drafting the values, and so I thought they would be a great place to start in terms of getting an overview for all of us. One thing that I want to remind you, if you're not super familiar with the value statement, is that the very last value, the final value that's listed, is that all members will have a commitment to openness, integrity, and humility in the work that we do. And I think everyone on the call would be able to agree that we uphold and pursue those values in the communities that we work with in our affected areas. But it's important to think of that as a value that we also practice in our relationships with one another in this kind of meta community or this learning community. So to that end, I invite you right now to silence your phone, turn off your phone, turn off the email. It can be super tempting on a Zoom call to kind of multitask, but remember that this is an investment in yourself and in your learning. Also, be fair to the developmental nature of our work. Some folks have been doing community-based work and working on behalf of neighborhoods for some time. Others are new to this work, but we all, I think, have something to gain in learning from one another. So let us certainly bring what I would call an intellectual fair-mindedness to this practice, an open-mindedness to the fact that we can learn from everyone's experience. And finally, remember that we should have a sense of humility and integrity toward one another, give each other time to listen, and respectfully disagree in these conversations. So let's lean into that final value. of openness, integrity, and humility. So with that said, what I can do maybe is do a quick a shout out. How does that sound for introductions so that Kent and Jennifer can hear who are on the call? I think I'll have Kent and Jennifer actually start because Jennifer's here, but she's listed as somebody else on your screen, so that way you'll know who Jennifer is at a minimum. But if we could also just have you all unmute your audio for a second and go through and introduce yourself. Your name may be listed or your telephone number, but also tell us what institution that you're at. And that way we'll know everybody who's here. And after that, we'll get into it. How does that sound?
Great.
Okay, great. So let's start with Kent and Jennifer.
Kent Koth from Seattle University, and to my right.
Erin Burrows, also Lasallian.
And to my left over here, kind of off the screen.
Tammy Shader, Seattle U.
Good morning, everyone. Contrary to my screen name, Samantha Kuhn, I borrowed her identity for the day. I'm Jennifer Pigza from St. Mary's College, and Samantha and a few of our colleagues from SILSA are in another room watching, so hopefully they'll be able to introduce themselves too.
Yeah, good morning. The two of the staff working with Jennifer Pigza are here. Our video is off right now, but Samantha Kuhn.
Good morning.
And myself, William Besson, coordinators at SILSA.
Hi, I'm Green Bouzard. I'm at Augsburg University in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'll be shortly hopefully joined by my colleague Mary Laurel True.
This is Dr. Lisa Norton. I'm with Toro University, California, and we are in the Bay Area, California. And I'm actually the Dean of the College of Education and Health Sciences and attended the conference this past June. So excited to be on the call.
I'm Jonathan Delgado. Here from University.
Bailey Wooten from Gonzaga. Molly Ayers from Gonzaga.
Karen Cotterman, University of San Francisco. Good morning, everybody.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, I'm Emery Capper from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia.
I'm Dan Justin from Regis University in Denver.
Chris Murphy from Georgetown University.
Hi, this is Dashani with Loyola University of Maryland. I'll be joined by Marie McSweeney Anderson in a few minutes.
I'm Cherry Oakley. I'm a community partner with the PACE Center for Civic Engagement with Princeton University.
I'm Heather Mack. I'm an SLCE assessment consultant.
My name is Jason Smith from the University of New Brunswick in St. John, New Brunswick.
I'm Julia Vargas with Rockhurst University in Kansas City, Missouri.
Rachel Hackstema. I'm at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington.
We have a couple people who introduce themselves on the chat, and that's a tool that we can use throughout this conversation as well. If you have a question, you don't want to interrupt the flow of the speakers. So we have Susan Harmon and Meredith Debbie. Susan from Loyola University Chicago and Meredith Debbie from Whitworth University.
Anyone else? Productions? Maybe, so Jennifer and I are going to tag team on providing a little bit of content as a means of engaging us in a collective conversation about how our values of the network are reflective in the values of our organization. And also, we also recognize that there's many ways the values of the network are aspirational. And they're aspirational for the network, and they're also aspirational for our direct work at our universities. So we'll also be talking about how we're aspiring to do this in our own organizations. So we'll provide a bit of framing for the next 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to open up for conversation We have a couple additional prompts as our call goes on. So I can start by, we took a look at the values, which are up on the slides. As Ross had described, we crafted these at a small gathering back in February. And I think the one thing that is to note is that our strategy, if you will, our tool we're using is place-based engagement, or neighborhood-based engagement, sort of tends to focusing on place. But the values and the purpose, or actually the purpose of the network, is focused on deconstructing systems of oppression. And the values then reflect both of those, both our strategy and our purpose. So you can kind of see what's on the screen here. We're pursuing an anti-oppression framework. We are also pursuing partnerships. And these are partnerships collectively among us, but also in particular how they play out in our given institutions and our communities that are long-term in nature, that reciprocity is valued, and that we're grounded in a process where we're engaging with each other in egalitarian ways. We recognize that our actions need to be defined by community-identified goals. And particularly, I think this latter part of the third statement that focus on self-determination, it's really self-determination on all fronts, for our community partners, in our case here at our university, for residents in the local neighborhood, but also for our faculty, staff, and students. The fourth point, which relates to on these calls and kind of the whole point of the network, is that continuous learning and continuous growth for all of us is really critical, and that a commitment to pursuing that collectively and individually is significant. And then the final point here, which Ross had noted in opening and framing our conversation today, the recognition of openness, integrity, humility, which I think places us all in the role of a contributor and also a learner. And particularly, I think the role of humility in our society today is something that we should really lean into. So I'm going to describe very briefly CLU, and then Jennifer is going to describe St. Mary's, and we're going to draw upon these values to describe what's occurring in our institutions, where we see we are living into these values, and also where there are some gaps. We utilize our own institutions simply as a jumping off point to ignite conversation among all of us about where, how these values play out in our institutions. So in a little bit, we'll be able to open up for wider conversation. So I've got a couple slides I wanted to share. The first is a quote that, from the former Superior General of the Jesuits that really guides our ethos as a university of why we have community engagement. When the heart is touched by direct experience, the mind may be challenged to change. And this quote, we often think of it as a driver of our work with students, where our college students and our graduate students might be out in the community and have different experiences that challenges them to see different perspectives. But it's also work that we're thinking of with young people in our neighborhood, and particularly if I were to name our work around race and anti-racism, which I'll describe more in a moment. I think this quote really talks to that, speaks to that as well. So our framework, or kind of our approach to, this is a map of our neighborhood that we're focused on. It's a 2 square mile radius in the city, or 2 square miles in the city just south of our campus. We've highlighted on the map a few of our community partners. Our work in this neighborhood is focused on youth and children and families. That also involves schools, which there's several listed here, an elementary school, middle school, and a high school. But it also involves issues related to housing and economic opportunity and access to healthcare. And so we have other partners in the neighborhood that are working on those topics. This is about, there's about 20,000 people that live in the neighborhood. It's really 3 neighborhoods. We adopted this geographic area when the public schools assigned this to be the Gatzer Elementary School assignment zone, which was in the year 2010. But the 3 neighborhoods that this encompasses, or portions of those neighborhoods, are Chinatown International District, which is home to our Chinese American, Vietnamese American, Filipino American, and Japanese American communities. It's kind of a cultural home for those communities. Yesler Terrace is a public housing community, which is in the middle of the neighborhood. And then the eastern part of the neighborhood is a portion of the Central District, which is the cultural home and connection point for our African American community. And we've been engaged in this neighborhood since 2011 in intensive ways where we have staff working in local schools, we have partnerships with families, and kind of are moving ever deeper into our work in the neighborhood. So then if we turn to the slide around our commitment to anti-racism, one of the things I would recognize in approaching something from a place-based, using a place-based strategy, is it invites us to move beyond transactional relationships with community partners into a much more significant partnership and thinking of a neighborhood and the people that live there and the leaders that are active and the history of those neighborhoods and how we connect. And so it invites us to explore significant issues that have always been present in our work, but perhaps we haven't taken as seriously because we've been mostly just focused on partnerships with organizations and not on kind of a community-wide focus. So as a center, about 2 years ago, we created a statement, a commitment towards anti-racism. This is a very abbreviated description of that. And I'll just quickly move through. Do our work means do our individual work, and that looks different depending on our racial identities and who we are. It also means doing our organizational work. As a center, we've been looking at our practices and principles, and it also means do our work in terms of engaging the systems that we're connected to. That would be our university systems. For us, it's also our school system, our city, our criminal justice system, a lot of other larger systems that are connected to our community partners and our residents. We have moved towards emphasizing partnerships led by people of color, recognizing that the communities in our neighborhood are very threatened by gentrification, and there's a lot of displacement occurring. So we're trying to amplify the voices of the organizations and the leaders who are trying to advocate for their communities and our local neighborhood. The work of anti-racism for us calls us to focus more on assets and lifting up that we all have skills and attributes to contribute on campus and off campus. And if we draw upon those and don't look with as much focus on our needs and our critical analysis, focusing on assets can lead to more positive results. We have a significant partnership with local families and trying to amplify the leadership of those local families. And then the final two items here, we're trying to utilize some tools to evaluate our work through an anti-racist lens. And there are a number of tools that can be drawn upon to do that. And then we are consistently trying to create a culture both here at the center and with our partners that is grounded in accountability for these commitments, and also a reflective capacity where we are giving ourselves some grace, recognizing that this is all involved with continuous learning and growth. So that's how I'd say sort of the place-based and our commitment to anti-oppression are anchored together. So maybe we'll shift now to Jennifer to share from St. Mary's.
Thank you, Kent, and thanks everyone who joined the call today. So I'm calling from St. Mary's College of California, and we are a Catholic and Lasallian liberal arts institution. The Lasallian's an order of Christian brothers in the Catholic Church dedicated to education and education of those at the margins. So the work of community engagement and of place-based justice really for us has very strong links to our founding and partnered or association with the Christian Brothers, as well as the Catholic tradition and also really the liberal arts tradition in terms of what is it, to what end are we learning, to what end do we ask good questions, how do we put that knowledge in action. We are a medium-sized to small, I suppose, institution, just to give you context for who we are. About 2,600 undergraduate students, 1,200 graduate students, and our graduate students are largely night and weekend programs, not really integrated into the undergraduate experience. About 800 students, undergraduates, every year are enrolled in a community engagement course. through our core curriculum. And if you do quick math, that's about a third of our undergraduate student body is in a course where they are connecting to community every year. Part of the organization that I lead is responsible for kind of the backbone services and community partnerships, et cetera, that make that happen. What's kind of interesting for us in terms of thinking about place-based initiatives and place-based work is our location. We are a suburban community, a bedroom community, if you will, for Oakland, San Francisco. There are even folks who live here that drive down to Silicon Valley to work. We're 12 miles east of Oakland, California. So we're not, I can't show you a map the same way that Kent can that overlaps my institution with the physical places where we are building place-based work. It's not the same way that we look at it and are able to really. So if I can have the next slide, Erin, please. The organization that I lead is an academic unit called the Catholic Institute for Lasallian Social Action. Our purpose is that we're working toward the day when all people collaborate to enact social justice, inclusion, and sustainability in all aspects of life. So that is our big audacious goal, is really to work towards that. And in order to do that, we're working with students, faculty, staff, community partners, communities themselves, to figure out what that's going to look like and how we can do that in just sustainable and inclusive ways, so that those ideas are both for us an outcome that we seek, justice, inclusion, and sustainability, but they are also the process by which we aim to seek them. So looking at those ideas as both process and outcome is really important in our framework. Our institution has a ambitious, audacious, kind of hair-raising goal some days for me, to think about having place-based initiatives in 4 locations. And that really came out of a shift in our undergraduate core curriculum, where community engagement became part of what every undergraduate student is experiencing in a course or a program. And conversations that said, wow, wouldn't it be better if we could concentrate our efforts in places that would make it not only easier for faculty and students, but also better for communities. And so we started thinking about this idea of having kind of some preferential zones of how we might organize our work and think about this work. And what we came to is a notion of not thinking about ourselves as an anchor institution, so to speak, or but really thinking about what are some anchor organizations in some different communities where we could kind of develop roots or build on the roots and the systems that we already have in place and move those forward, and really do think about, what would it look like if we work together on a 20-year horizon on some of the things that are important to these communities, what it would mean to be part of communities where we're not contiguously located. So there are big questions about it, but this is what our approach is. So we are connected with Alameda, California. I'll just tell you, it's about a 40-minute drive from where we are. Fruitvale neighborhood in Oakland, also about 40 minutes, depending on traffic. Concord is about 30 minutes, the opposite direction. And we do have a piece of place-based work that is about Moraga, which is our hometown. And what that looks like, I believe, is going to be very different. The issues of justice are not as evident, but there are some real ways that being engaged in community differently, beyond kind of the notion of a town gown, would make a difference for us and for the community and for St. Mary's. So the image in the center of the slide is of a head, a heart, and a hand, and that really reflects kind of the values that we bring to the work and the manner in which we work with all of the parties kind of involved in this process. So we're looking at how does this engagement and how does place-based work impact or engage our intellectual development, the mind, kind of questions, what kind of critical thinking, what kind of new knowledge is developed, the heart, kind of the place of what is our emotional engagement, what is our identity, how is that showing up, how does place-based work and engagement affect who we're called to be in the world, kind of both individually as well as organizationally or institutionally. And then the hand is the practical. What are we doing? What are we practicing? How can we learn to do that better? With whose hands are we joining in that work, etc. So the head, heart, hands frame is important for that, for us. And then I would say one of the things that we've done most recently is intensify, just to get to a practical thing that we're working on, is intensify the way in which we're preparing some of our student leaders to engage in the programs and courses that we have in our place-based initiatives, but also in other places where they may serve. And so we just have started with two folks from the University of San Francisco, Karen Cotterman, who's on the call, as well as Noliswe Nanamdula. I want to give them both gratitude for spending time with our students this past August and hopefully making a return appearance. But these are the two questions that we are focusing on with students, and I really think they're the same ones that we're trying to focus on as a staff and bring also to our work with faculty and other campus partners. Excuse me. How can we bring an anti-oppression and racial justice lens to our community engagement work and our life in communities? So we're really trying to emphasize that the place-based work that we do needs to be from an anti-oppression and racial justice lens, but also those kind of personal and organizational developments are equally applicable on our campus community and other networks that folks belong to. And then the other question is, how does this inform ethical and effective practices toward justice aims? So what does it mean to be ethically engaged in this work? I think one of the things that Kent and I were, we wanted to open up as a question for everyone is, how does the organization, how does your organization live the values, and where might the gaps be? And so we asked that question of ourselves, and I would say, where are the gaps? They're kind of everywhere. So, we are a people and an organization in process. And I would say one of the questions that's really surfacing for me when I look at the values and I look at some of the current status of our work and the kind of place where we are in the relationships with some of our community partners, is if I look at number 4, we recognize that change occurs through continuous individual and collective learning and action. And it's one thing to say that those of us in SILSA, my staff and I, and what we're trying to do internally at the college, that we're trying to bring that value forward. But what does it mean to partner with organizations and people who perhaps are not in the same place of thinking about their collective learning, or they might think about that question differently? And how do we partner when organizationally we may be in different places around this aspect of personal and organizational development? So that's a big question for me that has a real practical implication about some of the work that we're currently doing. And then the other thing I would add, so that's one gap. There's a lot of gaps, but we don't, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about this question. The other thing I would add around values is actually it's Samantha Kuhn, whose name I've borrowed today, really talks about the notion of curiosity. And so I think that is a word and a concept that I really tried to take on as well, is that, we honor that this work involves openness, integrity, humility. And I think for me, with Samantha's help, I'm really kind of taking on this notion of curiosity as well. Curiosity about myself, curiosity about challenge or about tension or about possibility. but just coming to things with curiosity has been quite helpful to me lately. So I'm wondering now, Kent, is it a okay time for us to open it up for other folks to share where they're seeing the values as well as perhaps gaps on their own campuses?
Over at the top of the screen, a couple of questions for all of us. And looks like there are 24 of us on the call, and some of us are in groups, so there's probably even more. So it might be helpful to identify who you are, and if you want to offer reflections, and we'll just want to kind of listen for who's kind of going to take turns.
Hey y'all, this is Marie. I'm under Vidushani's name right now, but from Loyola University. And all of this is really ringing true right now. Actually, just this morning, our team met to talk through our anti-racist framework and how we as a team are going to move forward this work. So I thought I would just share some of the stuff that we're working on currently and kind of future potentials. So this morning we came together to decide, and we have been putting time aside for 2 times per month, having our full team meetings being dedicated to moving forward anti-racist work. So what that kind of looks like, we determined this morning. So it will be 2 separate meetings and then 1 meeting together. The 2 separate meetings, we will work on our anti-racist kind of internal work and also follow, we put together a racial justice statement that I can send out, but we'll be working towards putting actions behind some of the resolutions that we identified. Some of that includes sharing information, some of that includes evaluation. And then coming together as a team to talk about those 1 time per month meetings, that the actions that need to be taken as a team. We're hoping in the future to have kind of an outside evaluation, but for the time being, working together with the knowledge that we have to put forward some really solid action steps.
Thanks, Marie. Others who want to share how you're living out the values, and then also where the gap is for you. And I guess I would also just share for CLU, I think the gaps, like as Jennifer was sharing, there are significant gaps. A couple of places that I would name it is that several years ago, the university utilized an outside consultant group to look at the climate on campus around inclusivity and diversity. And it surfaced some very significant issues, particularly for our faculty, staff, and students of color. And one of the questions I think that we've been asking here at the center is how can we contribute to the larger conversations on campus? And I think, Jennifer, to your point, there's different units on campus that are at different places in these explorations. So when to partner and when to push a little bit and when to kind of draw back are kind of questions that we're asking on a consistent basis. And then the other reality is just the experiences of our young people of color in our local schools as we look at the performance of kids in schools, and we break that down not just by income but by race. Particularly our young people of color are struggling significantly, and so it's trying to address issues related to institutional racism in our local schools, and what role we play in terms of being both an insider in terms of having staff in the buildings, but also an outside entity that can be kind of pushing or pointing out where there are gaps. So I just say the gaps are significant, and the values are helpful to guide us. But are there other observations about how you live this tension and kind of where you're at? Do you have tensions at your institution on these gaps?
Ken, I'm happy to share here at Whitworth, to go back to the point that Jennifer raised around the fourth value, which is wanting to ensure that continuous individual and collective learning occurs within our center or with our students or even with our faculty through faculty development programs. There's something that I feel that we can kind of easily control, but then with our partnerships out in the neighborhood, we have partners that we hold at different levels of proximity, I guess. And I'm sure that's the case with everybody. You've got your closer partners, your more strategic partners, and then you've got those that you work with probably less regularly. And then there's a similar tension there, I think, to the one that Kent described with, you have a partnership in place, but you're still an outsider to that organization. And so advocating for the kind of collective learning that might occur at your partner's location with your partner's staff around an understanding of anti-oppression work and anti-racist work is a difficult position, I think, to be in at times. I think also for some of us who come from universities with a faith-based orientation, decisions about partnership aren't necessarily decisions that we make at our own center level, but they could also have implications more broadly for the institution. There was a really great thread on the higher ed listserv over the summer that Emily Jenke started out from UNC Greensboro around what happens when politics, university politics, gets in the way of partnerships. And she outlined a couple of scenarios in which a governor in one case or state legislators were calling a chancellor to complain about either faculty research or student involvement in a particular issue in an area and how universities have navigated those. And that's something that I think I'm aware of in my institutional context as well. I feel like there's a great deal of support for our center's partnership, our center's membership in this network, and there's institutional support for embracing these values. But at the same time, I also face questions from, not frequently, but from either university cabinet, out of the president's office, or at the trustee level about partnerships and who should be partners that are a good mission fit for the university. Sometimes what's a good mission fit isn't always a good fit with the values of this network. Or at least I see a gap in place there, and I don't know if I'm alone in that. So navigating that is continuous learning process for me, and maybe for others.
I'd like to jump in. I didn't introduce myself. I'm not on the screen somehow, but I'm over the phone. My name's Dave Brown. I'm with Princeton University in New Jersey, and one of the tensions we have over partnerships is that we're so student-driven, and we are so responsive to the passions of the students in terms of what kind of work they want to do. And then we match them with the people in the community who are already doing this, and we feel really good about it. But if you really look a step deeper at that, it's us and our students still determining where we're putting our resources in the community, and the community not really necessarily having as much say as they should. So that's one of the areas of tension that we're looking at.
This is Molly at Gonzaga. I think this kind of builds off of what Ross was saying, but I think one of the things that we've been considering is we're looking at which organizations or partnerships we hold, and kind of our own, what we have to hold in terms of risk assessment and who we can partner with. So more of these informal organizations who we who traditionally don't have access to the institution or to partnerships within our organization, how do we kind of mitigate risk, and serve that role as risk manager in this process, where kind of more of the larger, more formalized organizations have that kind of address those issues and have that access with the institution.
So your Molly and Dave, both of your comments make me also think about the history of the development of service learning and community engagement in higher ed, how it's we were really critical in looking at kind of how it developed. It's really developed out of predominantly white culture and predominantly white institutions. And so some of, what I struggle with, and this has been a career for me, and I've worked at 3 different institutions that are predominantly white institutions. And I think the values that we have on our screen here, if we were to take them seriously, they force us to start unpacking some of the practices that we've really held as our primary drivers of our work. I think, Dave, your reflection of if we were to think of self-determination and allowing students to choose what they want to do, if we overemphasize that and don't think about our community partners, then we end up in a place we might not want to be. But there's still a need to allow our students and our faculty to have some kind of choice. But I sometimes think that our field has overemphasized one part of the equation. And I think that also, Molly, to your point around community partnerships, there's a similar weighting towards large organizations that are in our cities that often are white-led. And so how do we think creatively about how to move beyond that and more expansive thinking?
Exactly.
To Kent's point, a book that has been really taking me through a paradigm shift over the last probably 6 months is Service Learning as a Political Act in Education. And it is Courtney Hernandez out of Loyola Marymount University, building bicultural foundations for decolonizing pedagogy. Really takes a look at the sort of colonizing history of the creation of the service learning field, and then goes through a critical interpretive research methodology to unpack that, and then have a look at what principles of a critical decolonizing service learning approach would look like. And I'm wondering if that might not be relevant here too. I know I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself again. Heather Mack. I'm a service learning community engagement assessment consultant. I work with campuses around the country and also with nonprofits and foundations. And so part of the paradigm shift I'm going through is how to apply that lens and lay it over the assessment of service learning and place-based programs, so that the assessment is not perpetuating the systems of oppression. So that's not the same as where the rest of you guys are. I know you're in doing the work right now, so I didn't want to take time away from that, but that's an excellent resource if I can point people towards it. I want to.
I think, Heather, though, the kinds of questions that it sounds like that book raises are the kinds of questions that folks involved in the place-based justice network are thinking about. You know, as Kent just said, even thinking about, you know, many of us in this field grew out of service learning.
Yeah.
And still do things on our campuses that might be called service learning, or they're called now community engagement, you know, the more, you know, the terms as they change over time. And the question is, to what degree did the kind of structure behind those practices change, or did we just kind of change the name? You know, I think that would be a question that folks in this network are engaged in. And so I think that's great. I'm wondering, Heather, if you could use the chat box and just type in the title and author of that book.
My pleasure.
For those of us who couldn't write it down fast enough.
My pleasure.
And I think also I'm thinking about I'm sorry, I forget the gentleman from Princeton raising the question about student initiative, student choice. And I would say for us, what we're also more so kind of focusing on, or not focusing, but responding to our faculty, particularly for kind of connecting faculty with some of our place-based work, whether they're doing through a course or their own research, but to be able to say, you know, let's find out exactly what the partner would like to know in a research question, for example, instead of what kind of research question you think would be best to help your students learn whatever it is the content is and the learning outcomes of a class. So shifting those, shifting or sharing self-determination, perhaps from where it's traditionally sat to other people in the equation, and to even push the question about, you know, community development, community growth being perhaps more important than our own in the long term. And so what does it mean to really shift that mindset over time?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Y'all, this is Marie Anderson from Loyola in Baltimore again. And I think one of the biggest things that I really struggle with is that long-term reciprocal, but also community identified goals. And so I work with our York Road initiative. And so a lot of folks are really excited about our work in Baltimore on York Road, and they want to get engaged, but it's really hard for me to get them to think the step beyond the academic semester, and realize that we have ongoing relationships that need to be nourished, and also, you know, that there's a life outside of the academic semester. So I guess I know this is something that we all deal with, but what is the kindest, most wonderful way that you can bring people along on that trajectory?
Marie, I know that one trend, I suppose, in the field that I've found encouraging when I attended a pen to paper retreat back in August was to hear so many of the journal editors saying to faculty aspiring to do community engaged scholarship that the primary interest that they wanted to see faculty publishing on was around partner outcomes. And you could see light bulb after light bulb kind of going off over the heads of faculty attending, thinking, oh, I need to assess beyond my students, or oh, I need to assess beyond my own research question. And really causing faculty to think around, wow, I'm going to have to develop or perhaps go back and redesign the methodology for this particular project to take into account measurable impacts for the community as a result. And that may not be quick, that may take time. And so I find that an encouraging trend from within the domain of scholarship, you see folks orienting faculty toward thinking about their community impacts, which I think in turn will prompt many to consider those longer term partnerships, thinking beyond the outcomes of an immediate class or an immediate research agenda. I also wanted to bring attention to Susan Harmon's comment in the chat box. And for those of you who haven't seen it, Susan wrote that attention that she finds at her institution is the highly diverse nature of her immediate neighborhood. We are incredibly grateful for the range of folks that we work with, but often their identified goals are in conflict with other partners' goals, and they will sometimes come to us to mediate. It makes us both more aware of the power dynamics in the neighborhood that cannot be ignored or dismissed, but it's also a struggle to foster authentic mutual relationships. So I'm not sure if anybody can comment there, or if anyone has had a similar experience of being active in a neighborhood that might be decentralized in terms of the community's organizational capacity, or decentralized in terms of its power dynamics, and how you might have addressed that in terms of building authentic relationships.
Offer a reflection from CLU that and it's to the second value here of long-term and reciprocal and grounded in a deliberative process. That for us, we're entered into a partnership that doesn't have an end. And I think the first few years as we made this commitment, a number of our neighborhood partners, community leaders, and school leaders, parents, I think they were kind of watching with some cynicism, wondering whether, when's CLU going to stop and pull back, and I think now that we're 7 years in, and there's more, and we've been at it for a while, I think we've all, the other question, that those same questions were being asked by folks on campus, I think, as well. I think we've now had, there are times where we've tried things with partners and with neighborhood leaders and it's really worked. There's other times where it's been super messy and it didn't work. And I think in our prior world, if it didn't work with an organization, we would probably just take that organization offline. And that's the power that we would have had as an institution, like, oh, that was messy, let's not do that again, and we're not gonna partner with them. But in the case of focusing on a place, we're all in it together. And so it almost I found it just makes us more honest, more direct. We're able to fail and name it. And I think that that to the question of sort of them being involved in being a convener or a mediator, I think that then in some ways that's a natural evolution for potentially for our work, although very complicated because of some of the power dynamics that are present. But I've just found there's a richness in the long term. And there's also, it's much more complicated and raises much more complicated and complex issues than a model that is just focused on organizations. I think we've got a couple minutes left on our topic today. If anyone wants to weigh in with your reflections, maybe what you take from this conversation today, or even like additional questions we might want to explore in the future. And then we'll segue to Ross and Aaron, who will share what's ahead with some future Zoom calls and some other things related to the network.
I was having a hard, I don't know if you were talking to me directly, I was having a hard time. You're a little echoey. Could you repeat that?
Any reflections from anyone who's on the call about what you're taking from this, or encouragement of questions that we might want to explore in the future in Zoom calls or other conversations?
I'll say, Heather Mack, your reflections around decolonial community engagement and service learning is really speaking to me. I'm reading a book right now on decolonial methodologies research, and just thinking about the history, the deeper history of the land in which we're occupying has become more and more present for me, and thinking about place-based work, and that's a topic I would love for us to really dig into in the future. I had a brief conversation with Mary Laurel where she was talking about the indigenous history at Augsburg and how it's really a part of the work there. And I'm excited to have a deeper conversation about what that looks like in terms of how they prepare their students. And I don't know if anyone on the call has anything to add to that now, or if we can come back to that another time.
Oh, please go ahead.
I was going to say, Elaine Ikeda at California Campus Compact, Elena is bringing together maybe like half a dozen folks in the next month or so to begin to look at the question of looking at the racist history of our institutions, as well as the history of race in the land that we occupy as institutions. So I do know, just Aaron, to your question, so Elaine has been thinking about this with some different folks in California. She's like having folks for a lunch and conversation to begin to pose that question and to say, how can we are there ways to come together around that question that makes sense in the context of a campus compact, for example? And then I think how they make sense in terms of the place-based justice network, I think is quite applicable as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm really excited to hear that, to know that that's happening with Elaine and at the state campus compact level, especially since I moved to LA last year. So that's now my region. But I was going to say in response to both the comments and Kent's question that he posed. I'm wondering about, bless you, value number 1 with the anti-oppression framework. I'm just curious, this is my first time joining a conversation around this network, so maybe you guys have a definition in mind or specificity around how you're conceptualizing an anti-oppression framework. But there are decolonizing frameworks and anti-racist frameworks, and so I just was curious if you guys have gotten into the meat of the sort of continuum of those different frameworks, and if you're like, we welcome anybody who's thinking about any piece of this, or if there's characteristics that are actually really critical to this network or this learning community. I was just curious, and possibly for you guys to discuss in future conversations, or not at all.
We also got some suggestions in addition to Heather's comments. We got some suggestions in the group chat, which is great. And so the continuous learning subgroup will definitely take those. Looking ahead, we have 2 more Zoom calls this fall semester. I want to wrap up our time together and let you know that we'll be getting together on the 11th of October with our own Erin Burrows and Ine from, I believe, USF. Isn't that correct, Erin?
No, we're both from Seattle U.
Oh, both from Seattle U. Okay, great. I haven't met Ine yet. So they will be talking about intersectionality in our work, and perhaps pinning down one element of what Heather was hinting at toward the end of our conversation today, but considering intersectionality as a framework or a lens through which we do our work. Our second Zoom call will be in November, on the 8th of November, and we will be discussing how we create effective space for community voice. And that will be a discussion, I think, that will take us back to some of these political issues that we raised about how do we balance our students' needs with our partners' needs? How do we work within communities where partners see us as a mediator or a peacemaker, or potentially as a leader, and the leadership role may not be convenient. So bear that in mind. And the final announcement is that we do have our leadership retreat at St. Mary's University, hosted by Jennifer Pigza, who's here with us today. We're looking forward to that, December 12 through 14 at the end of the semester. Please be aware that you will receive an email after the Zoom call today inviting you to consider becoming a member of the Place-Based Justice Network. Membership does give you the opportunity to join the leadership retreats in the winter and to bring a team of 2 folks to those retreats. So there are benefits associated with membership, just like Costco, I suppose. And there you go. Coming from the Pacific Northwest, I guess I had to bring up Costco. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and welcome you to a future Zoom call. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.